Let's go ahead and pick it up for part 2 of our plant nutrition discussion. This time we're going to talk about each of the different elements and what do they do for your plant. Why does your plant need them, and how can you tell if your plant is missing them? I'll do just a brief overview from our previous lecture to highlight the key points. So that way, when we talk about all of these different elements, you'll have a little bit of context. Remember Liebigs Law, which is the idea that the least available element is the one that will stop growth. And so it doesn't help you to have more of something that's in abundance. The plant will grow until it hits a point at which it is now missing one of the 17 essential elements. And then once that one element is provided to the plant, then it will continue to grow until it hits the level of missing the next most scarcest element. This is important because we don't want to apply nitrogen when we're missing out on phosphorus. And we don't want to apply potassium when we need nitrogen. Now, remember that we've got macro elements and micro elements. So we have some of these that the plant needs in greater concentrations than others. So which one are we usually the most deficient in? Well, it's the one we need the most of, nitrogen. Here is the list of macro elements that the plant needs. Recognize that the first three, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those are the ingredients of sugar. Those come from the water and from the atmosphere, CO2 and H2O. So you don't need to add carbon to the soil in order for your plant to grow, because your plant is going to get carbon from CO2. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen make up over 95% of the actual biomass of the plant. So most of what it is made up of, the material, is CHO. And then the next three most important elements, because it needs them in the greatest amounts, is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. That's why those are the three elements listed on a fertilizer bag. And then our micro elements are needed in very small amounts. These are called the trace minerals, the trace elements, because you need very little bits of them. And so rarely are you going to be deficient in micro elements. Although you may have certain environments in which the micro elements are not available to your plants, it's rare that you actually need to add micro elements. Even though you only need a very little bit, if these elements are absent, you will not have proper plant growth. Remember that the minerals that are taken in, they are elements. But the element is just the name for the individual atom. But that's not what exists in nature. Most atoms exist in the form of molecules, which is a bunch of different atoms combined together. And in particular, our plants need to take in these elements in the form of water. So in order for them to dissolve, they need to be a salt. And the definition of a salt in chemistry is an ionic compound. So an ion is a particle or a compound that has a charge. And so it has a positive or a negative charge. And then this factor is what enables the compound to dissolve in water and be taken in through the plant's roots. So although our plants need nitrogen, they don't just take pure N, they have to take nitrogen in a special form. And it's important to understand what these forms are so that if we're looking to apply fertilizer or if we're looking to test our soil chemistry, we can be testing for the right thing. So let's take a look at nitrogen. Nitrogen is the most critical element in plant growth that comes from the soil. It's used in creating protein, in creating chlorophyll, nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA, and then other plant substances use nitrogen. So it's used all over the place. Nitrogen will cause thinner cell walls, which allows for faster cell division and growth in the plant. And it can only be absorbed into roots in two forms, ammonium or nitrate, NH4 positive and NO3 negative. The nitrogen cycle is something that we study. It's something we've talked about a little bit before, and there are many phases. It's important to understand that there is a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The vast majority of what the air that you breathe is made out of is nitrogen. But our plants cannot take in that nitrogen from the atmosphere. It is not an ionic compound. It's not available to the plants. And similarly, when that nitrogen from the air goes into the soil, the gaps, the pore spaces in the soil, it's still not available. It needs to be transformed. And there's several things that transform nitrogen in the soil. We've talked about legume plants and how they have an association with rhizobium bacteria. And that's one type of bacteria that lives in harmony with plants and actually will harvest atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that the plant can take in. Also, when plants die, they decompose, and the nitrogen that was in the plant bodies will be brought back to a molecular form that can then be taken back in. Same with animal manures. So animals, plants, things that decompose in the soil, along with the legumes, they are said to fix nitrogen because they are taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and fixing it or attaching it down to the soil. And that process is called fixation. The organic nitrogen in the soil gets picked up by living things and then taken into their bodies. When that happens, that's called immobilization because the nitrogen's been immobilized. It cannot move anywhere because it's inside the bodies of the organisms. Those organisms will get eaten by other organisms, and then what's left is the mineral deposits from the inside of those organisms. And that's called mineralization. And that gives us ammonium. The plant can take in ammonium itself, but also ammonium will go through other processes and turn into nitrate. Mineral fertilizers, when you apply them, are either in the ammonium form or the nitrate form. And nitrate in particular is prone to leaching, so you would need to be considerate of these different forms and how you apply them and making sure that it's done appropriately. The ammonium in the soil can go through volatilization, which converts it back to atmospheric nitrogen. The nitrate can go through a process called denitrification, which then sends it back to the atmosphere. And the whole thing is a cycle. So it's constantly changing forms, going from different media, from the air to the soil, to the organisms, back to the soil, up to the air. And our goal with growing plants is to make sure we always have enough in our soil. Now, interestingly, lightning is one of those rare occurrences that will deposit nitrogen. Lightning and rainfall will add a small amount of ammonium to the soil. This is not the primary way that we get nitrogen to the soil, but I include it here because it's an interesting thing to consider that the rainwater as it falls from the atmosphere, which is mostly nitrogen, the drops themselves contain soluble nitrogen that can then be taken in. So when it rains, that's not just water for our plants. That's also little bit of fertilizer for our plants. It's part of the reason why the plants look so good right after a rain, as opposed to irrigation water from the hose. Lightning will similarly deposit nitrogen into the soil, although I don't recommend you put out a bunch of lightning rods and try to attract the lightning bolts in order to add nitrogen to the soil, because it's much better to get it in there through decomposition of organic matter. And during that process, ammonium is released into the soil, which is totally available to plants' roots. Now, nitrate, on the other hand, is very prone to leaching, and based on your soil texture, you may have more or less leaching. And in particular, the sandy soils are very prone to being well drained, and so the water will flow through easily, and all of the nitrogen that's in that soil will also be leached out very easily. So in high rainfall climates, or if you are in an area of frequent irrigation and you have sandy soil, you may want to avoid any fertilizers that have nitrates and instead go with the ammonium form. Now let's take a look at the nitrogen deficiency symptoms. This is the first one we'll discuss, and we will discuss many. Nitrogen, first and foremost, is a mobile element. And what that means is that nitrogen, if it is lacking, it can be pulled from certain parts of the plant and redirected to more important areas. So in the case of a growing plant, what is the most important part of the growing plant? It's the young little tips that are still growing. And so if there is a nitrogen deficiency, the minerals will be pulled away from the old leaves down at the bottom of the plant and will be redirected up toward the new young leaves at the top. When that nitrogen is redirected, because it's so important for chlorophyll and for all the proteins, the old leaves turn yellow. All the green that was inside those leaves disappears, and you're left with a yellow leaf. So the nitrogen deficiency symptom is yellow leaves on the bottom, the old leaves showing the symptoms. As you continue to grow with a nitrogen deficiency, that yellowing will creep up to the top of the plant. Of course, knowing that nitrogen is the number one plant for growth, if we continue to have deficiency, we will have stunted growth, and the life cycle will pretty much be put on pause. Now, interestingly enough, if all you're missing is nitrogen, but you have plenty of water and plenty of everything else, the plant may not die. It's not necessary that it's going to just certainly die, but it will just kind of pause and hang out there until some nitrogen is acquired. That being said, plants that are deficient in their essential elements are going to be weak, and the weak plants are the ones that succumb to pests and diseases. And also, if there's harsh conditions in the environment, those would be the first to go. But I want you to know that a nutrient deficiency is not necessarily a death sentence for these plants. It's just an indicator that they need to be taken care of, that we need to manage our soil so we can ensure that it has the elements that the plants need and that it has them in an available form. This is why we learn deficiency symptoms. Now let's take a look at phosphorus. This is the second most needed plant nutrient. It has an important role in the nucleus of each cell for cell division. It's primarily found in the growing portions of the plant. Most plants get their phosphorus by organic matter breakdown near the roots. Just like nitrogen, we've got a phosphorus cycle, and mainly phosphorus comes from the deposit of animal manures. Now, there's phosphate fertilizer that is mined as a mineral, like a rock. But historically, The phosphorus fertilizers, even if they were mined, all came from deposits of animal manure, in particularly bird manure, guano, especially on islands, rocky islands. The seabirds that come in and hang out on those little rocky islands turn the little islands white, and over years you get a buildup of guano. That's a valuable source of phosphorus fertilizer. In fact, the Coronado Islands, the islands that are in Mexico, just south of the US-Mexico border, you can see them from Chula Vista. If you look on out, there was once a thriving phosphorus industry there where boats would take off and sail out to the islands. I think they're about 7 miles offshore, and then scoop up all the ancient guano and then bring it back and sell it to the farmers as phosphorus fertilizer. And there's a concern now that we're running out of the easily available phosphate to find in the world. Now, that's a problem if you're going to have a way of growing plants that relies on an import of phosphorus. But look at where else phosphorus comes from. It comes from plant residues. So if we can have composting and organic matter buildup in the soil, mulch, all of that will release phosphorus over time. The problem is it's slow release, and it doesn't really work well with industrial agriculture. Now, just like nitrogen, we've got a phosphorus cycle, and we want to consider this cycle so we can make sure we're operating sustainably, that we're managing inputs in a way that we're not pulling them out faster than they're being naturally put back in, or that we can naturally bring them back in ourselves. Don't worry about all the little details on this chart, but I just want you to understand that there's a natural cycle where all of these elements are transforming into different molecules as they go through different forms. Now, phosphorus has a very unique deficiency symptom. You tend to see leaves that turn purple. The reason is a phosphorus deficiency will slow cell division and it will stunt growth. But if you have enough nitrogen and you're only missing out on the phosphorus, then you're going to continue to have lots of new development inside the plant. It just will have nowhere to go. And so the leaves turn darker than normal. They actually get darker green the more deficient they are in phosphorus, until they become so deficient that it turns purple in color, because the plant cannot keep growing and distributing all the chlorophyll to different parts of the plant. Over time, if this continues, you will see a yellowing that occurs and leaf drop. And most importantly, for horticulturists, a phosphorus deficiency will severely limit the flowering and fruiting of plants. So oftentimes when you're growing crops that rely on a flower and a fruit, you will give them an extra boost of a phosphorus-based fertilizer or amendment right at the time when they're going to begin flowering. This is a mobile element as well, so the plant can redistribute phosphorus in from within. And so because it's a mobile element, that tells us we will tend to see the deficiency on the older leaves. Now, potassium, K. It can be tricky to remember that potassium is K. K is from the Greek. We call it potassium, but it couldn't say P because P is already taken by phosphorus. So we've got NP and K. Potassium is usually very abundant in your soil, in the mineral component of your soil, but it's very insoluble. So you don't have a lot that's available to your plants. In fact, some soils can contain up to 2% potassium just by weight. And so if that would be like 80,000 pounds of potassium on 1 acre of a farm, and your plants only need 150 pounds per acre per year. But even though it's there, it's not available. So that's why this potassium is the third element on the fertilizer bag. So here's an image showing a potassium deficiency. And this again is a mobile element. All of our primary nutrients are mobile because the plant needs a lot of them. With a potassium deficiency, we see yellowing occurring, but mainly on the margins of the leaves, not necessarily the entire leaf, as we would see with nitrogen. And this yellowing on the edges of the leaves will eventually turn brown and then dry up, and the leaves themselves will even curl under as they continue to grow with a potassium deficiency. In the old leaves, you'll end up seeing leaf burn, and it will just kind of turn into necrosis, and you'll have mottling and drooping of the leaves as well. The image here shows a corn leaf with a potassium deficiency. Notice the margins, the edges of that leaf, how they've turned brown. And in between the brown and the green, you can see a little layer of yellow. Next up, we'll discuss calcium. Calcium is very seldom deficient, except in very sandy soils, because calcite or lime is typically very prevalent in soils, and it's very soluble. Some soils can contain up to 1% by weight of calcium. Although those sandy soils, if they are constantly wet, a lot of rainfall or a lot of irrigation, we may end up leaching out the calcium because it is so soluble. Calcium is needed in large quantities because it's a major constituent of the cell walls. The cell walls themselves are made up of calcium. Now, calcium is the first one we'll discuss that is a non-mobile element. Non-mobile because it is already built into the cell walls of the plant. And so the plant does not have the ability to move the cell walls. Those are rigid and those are in place. And so calcium will stay tied up in older tissue. And so if you experience a calcium deficiency, you'll be experiencing it on the new leaves, the growing tips of the plant. You'll have odd growth, distorted growth, stunting, and death at the growing tips. It's rarely observed because calcium is typically very prevalent, but when you see it, it makes the plant look really weird. The image here is showing blossom end rot on a tomato, which is a condition that can happen when you've got a calcium deficiency. Now let's talk about magnesium. Calcium and magnesium typically go hand in hand when it comes to nutrition, and that counts with humans as well. And the ratio of calcium to magnesium is an important thing to consider in human nutrition. But magnesium is a major constituent of the chlorophyll molecule. Each chlorophyll molecule contains one atom of magnesium right in the middle of it, at the heart of the chlorophyll. Magnesium also will aid in the uptake of phosphorus. No magnesium means phosphorus uptake becomes more difficult. It's often found in dolomitic limestone. Again, just like calcium, this is rarely deficient in plants. Magnesium is a mobile element, so therefore the bottom leaves will show the symptoms first. And what we see with a magnesium deficiency is the condition called interveinal chlorosis. Chlorosis is the leaf turning yellow. It's losing chlorophyll. With a magnesium deficiency, the leaves will turn yellow, but the veins of the leaves will stay green. So we call this condition interveinal chlorosis. Look at the image on the top and bottom and observe the interveinal chlorosis of these leaves. As the deficiency continues to worsen, you'll get an overall yellowing, and then the leaf surface will tend to develop an interesting texture, kind of a puckering texture, and you'll see this right before a rapid drop in leaf. Now let's talk about sulfur. And notice I spell sulfur with an F, but the periodic table that I grabbed that image from used pH. Now, most scientists have agreed that sulfur in English is spelled with an F. But if you're from the UK, and especially if you're a non-scientist, you tend to spell it with the pH. So when you write out sulfur, I encourage you to spell it like a scientist, use the F. Sulfur is required for the synthesis of other vital minerals in plants. It's usually quite low in soils and it'll be obtained from decomposing organic matter. Alkaline soils in particular are low in sulfur. We can apply sulfur to the soil. Usually we do this in a fertilizer, or if we add gypsum. Now, gypsum is a common amendment that is put into clay soils to help break up the heavy, solid nature of clay soil and to improve the structure. So gypsum or fertilizer added to the soil will add sulfur in a soluble form. Sulfur is a non-mobile element, and the deficiency symptom looks similar to nitrogen. You'll get a yellowing of the entire leaf. But because this is non-mobile, we will see the yellowing at the new growth. After a while, the entire plant can take on a light yellow appearance, and we'll have stunted growth, spindly growth, and then we'll very soon after see necrosis. So necrosis is dead spots on the leaves. Now let's take a look at iron. Iron is used in the chlorophyll molecule. It's generally found in most soils, but in alkaline soils, which we tend to have here in Southern California, iron may be present. It may even be abundant, but it is not available. It is not soluble at an alkaline pH. Iron is a non-mobile element, so we see the deficiency symptoms in the young leaves first. And here we see that similar interveinal chlorosis, yellowing between the veins. Iron deficiency is much more common than a magnesium deficiency. So interveinal chlorosis is often just referred to as iron chlorosis. So if your plants are displaying interveinal chlorosis, it's more likely that you have an iron deficiency than a magnesium deficiency. And that iron deficiency is likely experienced because of a high pH. A high pH puts our soils on the alkaline side and ties up iron from being absorbed by our plants. In very severe cases of an iron deficiency, the leaves will turn almost white. Eventually, you'll have new shoots die back at the tip. Now let's talk about manganese. Manganese is needed in many plant enzymes, and it's like an enzyme activator. It's usually readily available to plants, except in the most highly alkaline of soils. It is released naturally during the process of soil weathering. And if you're in a highly acidic soil, the amount of manganese could become overly available and therefore toxic to your plant. A manganese deficiency can be difficult to differentiate from an iron deficiency. It's a non-mobile element. It's got interveinal chlorosis. You'll also have dwarfing occurring or stunting of the plant growth, followed by necrotic spots. Now let's talk about copper. Copper is given off by rock during the process of weathering as well. It too is needed for enzymes and respiration, and is found in the chloroplasts. And just like our others, it can be tied up in highly alkaline soils. Copper is a mobile element, but deficiency is very rare. These are trace elements now, and our plants do not need them in very high amounts. But if you do have a copper deficiency, you can get twig dieback and you can get necrotic spots. It's much more common to have a copper toxicity, which can be very harmful to human health. Now let's talk about zinc. Zinc is used in plant hormone synthesis. And it too is one that could be tied up by a highly alkaline soil. Zinc's also very important for human nutrition, and we need zinc to help us absorb all of our other minerals. In plants, it's a non-mobile element, and a zinc deficiency will display a mottled yellow spot. So not quite intraveinal chlorosis. It's more of a mottling color. And the plant growth itself will be characteristic because the gaps between the nodes where leaves and flowers develop will be shortened. So you'll have a lot of leaves close together on the stem. That can be so extreme that it causes the leaves to form what appears to be a rosette. They look like they're all coming out at the same point, but really it's just that the internodes are not able to develop. And you'll also experience small leaves overall. Now let's talk about boron. Boron aids in calcium utilization in plants. It's usually available in most soils. It's found in decomposing organic matter, and we've got plenty of it in our soils. But if your soil is on the dry side, you may experience a deficiency because the organic matter is slower to break down. So the rate at which boron is supplied may be diminished if your soil is very dry and decomposition slows. A boron deficiency will display poor cell wall formation, and the leaves themselves typically become very distorted and crinkly. They'll tend to look darker green and be more thick than usual. And you'll also have the petioles twist so that the leaves look like they're curling upside down and crinkly in all sorts of ways. And now I'll just speed through the last three that I'll cover here, just so that I've introduced them. You can take some notes on them, and that'll round out our part 2 to plant nutrition. Next up, we've got chlorine. Chlorine aids in the transport of cell fluids. We end up having chlorine in the atmosphere coming from the ocean. And so there's actually a small amount of chlorine in the rain when it comes out of the atmosphere. It's rarely deficient for that reason. A chlorine deficiency typically needs to be lab-induced, and you can look and see on the durum wheat in the image. Notice that speckled coloration on the leaf. That's displaying a chlorine deficiency. Now we'll cover molybdenum. Molybdenum aids in making nitrogen available to the plant. It is released to the soil by weathering minerals, and in acid pH soils, molybdenum can be fixed by iron. So molybdenum is a mobile element. A deficiency looks similar to nitrogen, but the plant will also typically show cupping of the leaf due to the leaf margins not expanding, as you can see with that cauliflower image on the right-hand side. After a while, you'll see some necrosis on the margins of the leaves, and because it's mobile, these show up on the old leaves first. And finally, we'll cover nickel. Nickel is a non-mobile element. It's used in overall nitrogen metabolism. It's needed in very small amounts. But you rarely will see a nickel deficiency. But if you do, you'll see chlorosis of the young leaves, and then later the death of the meristem, which is the point at which new growth occurs in the plant. So there you have it. There's a brief overview of the minerals, the roles they play, and the deficiency symptoms. It's rare that you see deficiencies in your micronutrients, although some of them, like boron, can be quite characteristic and easy to observe. It's much more likely that you'll see your deficiency symptoms in N, P, K. So getting those three down, and then maybe iron is the other one that's common in our area because of our alkaline soil. If you get those down, you can go a long way to understanding what the plant is experiencing as it's trying to grow and reproduce in order to complete its life cycle. And if you can develop an observation that sees this, you can know if the plant is getting enough minerals at the right time and which minerals are deficient. It makes no sense to add more nitrogen if you are deficient in iron or if you're deficient in phosphorus. So based on the colors, where on the plant you observe them, the plant will be telling you what it needs. I hope you found this enlightening and that it added another layer upon your understanding of minerals in the soil and plant nutrition. Thanks a lot.